What happens when a 52-year-old woman shows up to the most brutal military training program in America? The elite commandos thought they knew. They were dead wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, its jagged peaks piercing a steel-gray sky that promised nothing but punishment. Hidden deep within this unforgiving landscape sat Camp Thunderbolt, a facility so classified that it didn't appear on any military maps. Its razor-wire perimeter and concrete watchtowers stood like sentinels against the pine forests, guarding secrets that could never see daylight. Inside the compound's main briefing hall, 43 of America's most elite soldiers sat in rigid formation, their backs straight as steel rods. These weren't ordinary troops, they were the cream of the crop, handpicked from Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, and Air Force Special Operations. Each had survived tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified operations that would never make the evening news. Their chests displayed ribbons that told stories of valor most civilians couldn't comprehend. Staff Sergeant Michael Razor Patterson stood at the front of the room, his imposing 6'4" frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow light itself. His scarred face bore the marks of 15 years in special operations, including a particularly memorable encounter with an IED in Fallujah that had left him with a distinctive scar running from his left temple to his jaw. At 38, he was the youngest instructor ever selected to run the Advanced Tactical Survival Program, a 6-week course designed to push even the most hardened warriors beyond their breaking points. Gentlemen, Razor's voice cut through the silence like a blade. You think you're tough. You think you've seen hell and walked back out with a smile. His eyes swept across the assembled commandos, each one a killer in their own right. You're about to learn how wrong you are. The program had a 93% failure rate. Of the thousands who had attempted it over the past decade, only 67 had earned the coveted Thunderbolt patch, a black lightning bolt on a blood-red background that marked its wearer as belonging to an elite within the elite. These graduates went on to classified missions that didn't exist, in places that weren't on maps, fighting enemies that had no names. Captain Derek Washington, a former SEAL Team 6 operator with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for never backing down, leaned forward slightly. At 29, he'd already completed 3 tours in special operations, and had the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were among the best warriors on the planet. Beside him sat Lieutenant Marcus Bull Rodriguez, a Force Recon Marine whose explosive demolitions expertise had earned him legend status among his peers. The youngest of the group, Sergeant Tommy Ghost Sullivan, barely 25 but already a master of infiltration, sat with the stillness of a coiled spring. The next 6 weeks will strip away everything you think you know about yourselves, Razor continued, his boots echoing against the concrete floor as he paced. You'll crawl through swamps filled with water moccasins, scale cliff faces in sub-zero temperatures, and survive on insects and rainwater while evading hunter-killer teams that have been given authorization to use live ammunition. A few of the commandos exchanged glances, but their expressions remained stoic. They'd all been through hell before. This was just another level of the same game. Sleep will become a luxury you can't afford. Food will be something you remember from better days. And when you think you've reached your absolute limit, when your body is screaming for mercy and your mind is begging you to quit, that's when the real training begins. The heavy metal doors at the back of the briefing hall suddenly groaned open, their sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Every head turned as footsteps echoed against the concrete, but these weren't the heavy, measured steps of a military boot. They were lighter, more careful, with an odd rhythm that seemed almost hesitant. Through the doorway walked a woman who seemed to have materialized from another world entirely. At 52, Sandra Mitchell moved with a careful deliberation. of someone who'd learned to navigate spaces where she wasn't expected. Her graying auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her slight frame, maybe 5'6" and 140 pounds soaking wet, was dwarfed by the athletic giants surrounding her. She wore the same basic fatigues as the other candidates, but on her, they seemed to hang loose, as if the military hadn't quite figured out how to outfit someone who looked like she should be organizing a neighborhood book club rather than preparing for the most dangerous training program in the American military. The silence that followed her entrance was deafening. 43 pairs of eyes tracked her movement as she made her way to an empty chair in the back row, her worn duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The bag itself told a story. It was old, obviously military issue, but from a different era. The fabric was faded, the straps repaired multiple times with different colored thread, and there were patches of what looked like chemical burns along one side. Captain Washington was the first to react, a snort of disbelief escaping his lips. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, though his voice carried clearly in the silent room. "What's next? Bring your daughter to work day." Lieutenant Rodriguez leaned over, his voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for nearby commandos to hear. "Maybe she's lost. Someone should probably help her find the visitor center before she gets hurt." Sergeant Sullivan, known for his dry wit, couldn't resist chiming in. "Hope she brought her reading glasses. Gonna be hard to see the targets." From the nursing home, the comments rippled through the assembled soldiers like wildfire. These were men who'd built their identities on being the toughest, the strongest, the most dangerous. The presence of a middle-aged woman in their ranks wasn't just unexpected, it was insulting. It challenged everything they believed about themselves and their exclusive brotherhood. Sandra said nothing as she settled into her seat, her movements economical and purposeful. She placed her duffel bag on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm and unreadable. There was something in her posture that suggested she'd been through this before, not this exact situation, but the experience of being the outsider, the one who didn't belong. Staff Sergeant Patterson had been watching the exchange with growing irritation. He'd seen enough combat to know that assumptions could get you killed, and he didn't appreciate his candidates making light of anything before they'd even begun. But even he had to admit that Sandra Mitchell's presence was unusual. "Mitchell," he called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Front and center." Sandra rose smoothly and walked to the front of the room, her step sure despite the 43 pairs of eyes boring into her. Up close, the contrast was even more stark. Where the male commandos radiated barely contained violence, she seemed almost serene, like a librarian who'd wandered into the wrong building. "Ma'am," Patterson said, his tone respectful but puzzled, "I'm going to need to see your authorization papers. There seems to be some kind of administrative error." Sandra reached into her breast pocket and produced a set of orders that looked different from the standard military paperwork. The document was signed with clearance levels that Patterson recognized but had never seen in person, the kind of authorization that came from very high up the chain of command, with classifications that suggested involvement from agencies that didn't officially exist. As Patterson read the orders, his expression gradually shifted from confusion to surprise to something approaching respect. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he reached the bottom of the page, where a signature from the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized Sandra Mitchell's participation in the program under Special Directive 7 Alpha. "Well," Patterson said. Finally, his voice carefully neutral, "it appears everything is in order." He handed the papers back to Sandra, who tucked them away with the same calm efficiency she'd shown throughout the encounter. The commandos watched this exchange with growing curiosity. Whatever was in those orders had clearly changed Patterson's attitude, and if something could surprise Razor Patterson, it was worth paying attention to. "Take your seat, Mitchell," Patterson sighed. "We'll begin the preliminary briefing in 5 minutes." As Sandra returned to her chair, the whispers began again, but this time they carried a different tone. The easy mockery had been replaced by uncertainty, and uncertainty was something these elite warriors weren't accustomed to feeling. Captain Washington studied Sandra more carefully now, trying to read something in her demeanor that might explain her presence. But she remained an enigma, sitting quietly with her hands folded, looking for all the world like someone's aunt who'd taken a wrong turn on her way to a garden party. The storm was gathering outside Camp Thunderbolt and inside the briefing hall. 43 of America's most elite soldiers were about to learn that their assumptions about strength, endurance, and survival were about to be challenged in ways they'd never imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pre-dawn darkness at Camp Thunderbolt was absolute, broken only by the harsh glare of floodlights that cast skeletal shadows across the obstacle course. At 0400 hours, the temperature had plummeted to 12 degrees below zero, and the Montana wind cut through the compound like a serrated blade. Ice crystals formed on every exposed surface, turning the training ground into a frozen hellscape that would have made Siberian prisoners weep. Staff Sergeant Patterson stood at the edge of what the instructors called the meat grinder, a 2-mile obstacle course that had been designed by sadistic engineers who clearly enjoyed other people's suffering. Razor wire glinted with frost, wooden walls rose 30 feet into the air, and mud pits had frozen into treacherous ice sheets that could shatter bones with a single misstep. This wasn't just physical training. It was a psychological weapon designed to break the human spirit. Ladies and gentlemen, Patterson's voice boomed across the frozen wasteland, his breath creating clouds that dissipated instantly in the bitter air. Welcome to day 1 of your educational experience. You have exactly 90 minutes to complete the course. Anyone who fails to finish will be packing their bags before breakfast. The 43 commandos stood in formation, their bodies steaming in the cold air as they performed final equipment checks. Each wore 60 pounds of gear full combat load, including weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and survival equipment. The weight was distributed across their frames like a second skin, familiar and comforting to warriors who'd carried similar loads through the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq. Captain Washington bounced slightly on his toes, his massive frame coiled like a spring ready to unleash. His SEAL training had prepared him for underwater demolitions and Arctic conditions, and a frozen obstacle course seemed almost mundane by comparison. Beside him, Lieutenant Rodriguez cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp as gunshots in the frigid air. His Force Recon background had taught him to treat pain as information. Nothing more. Sergeant Sullivan stood perfectly still, his lean frame betraying none of the nervous energy that radiated from the others. His specialty was infiltration and reconnaissance, which meant he'd learned to move through hostile territory without making a sound. An obstacle course was just another environment to navigate. And then there was Sandra Mitchell. She stood at the far end of the formation, her slight frame almost invisible among the giants surrounding her. While the commandos made final adjustments to their gear with practiced efficiency, Sandra seemed to be conducting some kind of internal inventory. Her fingers moved methodically across her equipment, checking straps and buckles with movements that were economical and precise. There was something hypnotic about her preparation ritual, as if she were performing a ceremony that had deeper meaning than simple equipment checks. "What's she doing?" whispered Corporal Jimmy "Tank" Harrison, a former Army Ranger whose nickname came from his ability to punch through enemy lines like an armored vehicle. "Looks like she's praying or something." "Maybe she's writing her will," Rodriguez muttered, earning snickers from nearby commandos. "Gonna be a short one. I leave everything to whoever finds my body." Sandra's head turned slightly at the comment, and for just a moment, her eyes met Rodriguez's. There was something in that gaze, not anger, not hurt, but a kind of patient assessment that made the Marine feel suddenly uncomfortable. It was the look of someone who'd heard every possible insult and had moved far beyond caring about them. "Move out!" Patterson's command shattered the morning stillness. The course began with a sprint across a field of ice-covered stones, each one placed at irregular intervals, designed to destroy ankles and shatter confidence. The Commandos exploded forward, like thoroughbreds released from the starting gate, their boots finding purchase on the treacherous surface through pure athletic ability and muscle memory. Washington took an early lead, his powerful legs churning through the obstacle field with mechanical precision. Rodriguez and Sullivan flanked him, their different body types adapting to the challenge in their own ways. Behind them, the pack of elite soldiers spread out according to their specialties and physical capabilities, and Sandra Mitchell. She was last. Not struggling, not flailing, just methodical. Where the Commandos attacked each obstacle with overwhelming force, Sandra seemed to be solving puzzles. At the rope climb, while Washington powered up through sheer upper body strength, Sandra used a technique that distributed her weight differently, her legs doing work that her arms couldn't handle. At the wall traverse, while Rodriguez bulldozed through using his explosive power, Sandra found handholds that the others had. Mist, moving across the surface like a spider navigating its web. "She's holding everyone back," Tank Harrison panted as he cleared the barbed wire crawl, his uniform torn and bloodied from the razor-sharp obstacles. "This isn't a Sunday hike, lady." But something strange was happening. As the course progressed, the gap between Sandra and the main pack wasn't growing, it was shrinking. Not because she was speeding up, but because they were slowing down. The brutal pace that had seemed sustainable at the beginning was taking its toll on bodies that had been pushed beyond their limits in previous conflicts. Washington, who'd maintained his lead through the first mile, found himself struggling with the ice wall climb. His massive frame, which had been an advantage in the early obstacles, was now working against him as he tried to find purchase on the frozen surface. His breathing had become labored, and steam rose from his body like a racehorse. Pushed too hard, Rodriguez was experiencing his own crisis at the rope bridge. His usual strategy of powering through obstacles was failing him as his grip strength began to fade. The 60-pound pack that had felt manageable at the start now seemed to be dragging him toward the frozen ground. 30 feet below, Sullivan, whose endurance had always been his strongest asset, was discovering that his body was betraying him in ways he'd never experienced. His legs felt like concrete pillars, and his lungs burned with each breath of the Arctic air. And then, impossibly, Sandra Mitchell began passing people. Not with dramatic bursts of speed, but with the steady progress of someone who understood something the others didn't. She moved past Tank Harrison as he struggled with the rope climb, her technique so fluid that she seemed to float upward. She glided past 3 more Commandos at the wall traverse, her movements economical and precise where theirs had become desperate and wasteful. "What the hell?" Washington gasped as Sandra appeared beside him at the ice wall. Up close, he could see that she wasn't even breathing hard. Her face was calm, almost serene, while his own lungs felt like they were filled with molten lead. "Pace yourself," Sandra said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "It's not a sprint." Before Washington could respond, she was past him, her movements up the ice wall so smooth that she seemed to be defying gravity itself. She used tools from her pack that the others had ignored, small metal spikes that she placed and removed with mechanical precision, creating a ladder where none had existed before. By the time she reached the top, Washington was still struggling. Halfway up the wall, his massive strength useless against the physics of ice climbing. Below him, Rodriguez had fallen twice and was starting his 3rd attempt, his face a mask of frustrated determination. The final obstacle was a 1/4-mile run through knee-deep snow, followed by a 100-yard belly crawl under barbed wire that hung just 18 inches above the frozen ground. It was designed to be the final insult, the last push that would separate the warriors from the wannabes. Sandra emerged from the snow field in 3rd place, her breathing still controlled, her movements still precise. The two commandos ahead of her, both specialists in Arctic warfare, were stumbling like drunken sailors, their bodies finally succumbing to the accumulated stress of the course. She began her crawl under the barbed wire with the same methodical approach she'd shown throughout the morning. While others had torn their uniforms and skin on the razor-sharp obstacles, Sandra seemed to flow beneath them like water, her body contorting in ways that avoided the worst of the hazards. When she crossed the finish line, she was alone. The commandos had been making jokes about nursing homes and garden parties 90 minutes earlier were scattered across the course like casualties of a real battle. Some were still struggling with obstacles that Sandra had completed 20 minutes ago. Others had given up entirely, their bodies and spirits broken by a course that had seemed manageable when they'd started. Staff Sergeant Patterson stood at the finish line, his stopwatch in his hand and an expression of complete disbelief on his scarred face. In 15 years of running the program, he'd never seen anything like what had just happened. Sandra Mitchell, the 52-year-old woman who'd looked like she belonged in a library rather than a military training facility, had just completed the most brutal obstacle course in the American military faster than 90% of the elite commandos who'd started alongside her, and she wasn't even breathing hard. The mess hall at Camp Thunderbolt buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with the watered-down coffee and reconstituted eggs being served for breakfast. News of Sandra Mitchell's performance on the obstacle course had spread through the facility like wildfire, and the reaction wasn't what she might have hoped for. Instead of grudging respect, her success had ignited something far more dangerous. Wounded pride mixed with territorial aggression. Captain Washington sat at the head of the largest table, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something darker. His left shoulder bore fresh bandages from where he'd scraped against the barbed wire during his third attempt at the crawl section. The physical wound was nothing compared to the psychological damage of being outperformed by someone he'd dismissed as a joke just hours earlier. "It's a setup," he declared, stabbing at his eggs with unnecessary force. "Has to be. Nobody just walks into Thunderbolt and schools operators on day one, not without inside information." Lieutenant Rodriguez nodded vigorously, his own pride still stinging from his multiple falls during the ice wall climb. "Maybe she's some kind of Pentagon inspector, testing our reactions to unconventional candidates. You know how they love their social experiments. Or maybe she's foreign intelligence," suggested Tank Harrison, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Think about it, shows up with mysterious authorization papers, demonstrates skills that don't match her profile, and now she's gathering intel on our training methods." The speculation grew more elaborate with each passing minute. Some suggested she was a CIA operative testing their security protocols. Others theorized she was a military contractor hired to evaluate the program's effectiveness. A few even whispered that she might be some kind of enhanced operative from a classified super soldier program. None of them considered the possibility that Sandra Mitchell was simply better prepared than they were. 3 tables away, Sandra sat alone, methodically working through her breakfast with the same calculated efficiency she'd shown on the obstacle course. She'd learned long ago that eating in hostile environments required the same strategic thinking as any other survival skill. Consume the calories you need, ignore the politics, and conserve energy for the battles that actually matter. She was acutely aware of the hostile attention focused on her, but she'd navigated similar situations before. The whispers, the stares, the barely concealed resentment, it was all familiar territory. What was different here was the level of skill possessed by her adversaries. These weren't desk jockeys or weekend warriors who could be easily dismissed. These were genuine killers who'd earned their reputations in the world's most dangerous places. Mitchell. The voice belonged to Sergeant Sullivan, who'd approached her table with the silent movement that had earned him his ghost nickname. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes that set him apart from the others. Where Washington relied on brute force and Rodriguez on explosive aggression, Sullivan was a thinker, which made him potentially the most dangerous of the three. "May I sit?" he asked, his tone respectful but probing. Sandra nodded toward the empty chair across from her, curious about this departure from the group dynamic she'd observed. Sullivan settled into the chair with fluid grace, his movements economical and precise. "Interesting technique you used on the rope climb," he said conversationally. "I've seen similar approaches in rock climbing, but never applied to military obstacles." "Adaptation is survival," Sandra replied simply, continuing to eat without looking up. "Indeed." Sullivan studied her for a long moment. "You know, I've been thinking about your performance this morning. Very impressive, but it raises some questions." "Questions?" "About preparation, about background, about why someone with your obvious capabilities would suddenly appear in a program like this." Sullivan leaned forward slightly. "See, the thing about ghost operations is that they leave traces if you know how to look, and I'm very good at looking." Sandra finally raised her eyes to meet his gaze. "And what have you found?" "Nothing," Sullivan admitted. "Which is interesting in itself. Your service record is classified at levels I can't access. Your training history is redacted, and your authorization papers came from offices that don't officially exist. That's not the profile of a weekend warrior who got lucky." "No," Sandra agreed. "It's not." The simple admission hung between them like a challenge. Sullivan had expected denials, deflections, or elaborate cover stories. Instead, he'd gotten confirmation that his suspicions were correct, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. "So the question becomes," Sullivan continued, "what's someone with your background doing in a program designed to train people like us?" Before Sandra could respond, the mess hall's relative quiet was shattered by the harsh wail of the alarm system. The sound meant one thing at Camp Thunderbolt: immediate muster for an unscheduled training exercise. "All personnel report to the armory in 5 minutes. Patterson's voice boomed over the intercom. "Full combat gear." This is not a drill. The transformation was instantaneous. The Commandos abandoned their breakfast and moved with the fluid efficiency of a machine designed for violence. Conversations ceased, chairs scraped against concrete, and 43 elite soldiers became a single organism focused on warfare. Sandra rose from her table and moved toward the exit, but her path was blocked by Captain Washington and his growing circle of supporters. The captain's eyes held a hard gleam that suggested the morning's humiliation had crystallized into something more focused and dangerous. "Where do you think you're going, Grandma?" Washington's voice carried just enough volume to draw attention from the nearby tables. "To the armory," Sandra replied calmly. "Same as everyone else." "See, that's where you're wrong." Washington stepped closer, using his size to create a physical barrier. "This isn't some feel-good integration program. This is serious business. And people get hurt when they're not prepared. I'm prepared." "Are you?" Rodriguez had moved to flank her left side, while Tank Harrison covered her right. "Because what happened this morning was just playground games compared to what's coming. We're talking live-fire exercises, close-quarters combat, survival training that would break a normal person's mind." "I'm not normal," Sandra said quietly. The admission seemed to surprise them. Washington had expected fear, intimidation, or at least uncertainty. Instead, he was facing someone who appeared genuinely unimpressed by his psychological warfare. "Listen, lady," Washington's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this isn't the place for it. People die in this program. Real operators with real skills who made real mistakes. You want to prove some point about women's equality or age discrimination, find another sandbox." Sandra studied the 3 men surrounding her with the calm attention of a scientist examining specimens. "Captain Washington," she said finally, "you're operating under several false assumptions. Such as that I'm here to prove a point, that I'm unprepared for what's coming, and that you have any authority to decide who belongs in this program. The temperature in the mess hall seemed to drop several degrees. Washington's face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists that looked like they could punch through concrete. "You arrogant, Mitchell, Washington, Rodriguez." Patterson's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You've got 30 seconds to get to the armory, or you'll be explaining to the colonel why you missed muster." The standoff dissolved as military discipline overrode personal conflict. The commandos moved toward the exit, but the hostile energy remained, crackling between them like electricity before a storm. As they filed out of the mess hall, Sandra found herself walking beside Sergeant Sullivan, who'd observed the entire confrontation with professional interest. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "Experience. I imagine you have quite a bit of that." Sullivan paused at the armory door. "Word of advice, Washington's not the type to let things go. He's going to be looking for an opportunity to prove his point, probably in a way that doesn't involve official oversight." Sandra nodded, acknowledging both the warning and the unexpected gesture of alliance. "Thank you for the heads up." "Don't thank me yet," Sullivan replied as they entered the armory. "Because if you're not who I think you are, what's coming next is going to destroy you." The armory was a cavern of organized violence, its walls lined with weapons that ranged from standard issue rifles to exotic tools designed for missions that didn't exist. As the commandos began selecting their gear, Sandra moved to a section that the others had ignored, a Conda collection of older weapons that most modern soldiers would consider obsolete. She lifted a worn M14 rifle, its wooden stock scarred by decades of use, and began her inspection with the practiced movements of someone who'd maintained similar weapons under far worse conditions. The rifle was old, but it had been meticulously cared for, and she could feel the balance and weight that came from precision manufacturing. "Interesting choice." Patterson appeared beside her, his expression unreadable. "Most people go for the newer systems." "Newer isn't always better," Sandra replied, continuing her inspection. "Sometimes the old ways work just fine." Patterson studied her for a long moment. "Mitchell, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want a straight answer. Are you going to be able to handle what's coming?" Sandra looked up from the rifle, meeting his gaze directly. "Sergeant Patterson, I've been handling things like this since before some of these boys were born." "That's what I was afraid of," Patterson muttered, but there was something in his tone that suggested his fear wasn't about Sandra's capabilities. It was about what those capabilities might reveal about the true nature of the program they were all part of. Outside, the Montana wind howled through the compound, carrying with it the promise of trials that would test not just physical endurance, but the very foundations of identity that each of these warriors had built their lives upon. The helicopter blades chopped through the Montana sky like mechanical thunder, their rotor wash flattening the snow-covered pines below into submission. Inside the aircraft's cramped interior, 22 commandos sat in tactical formation, their faces painted in winter camouflage patterns that made them look like warriors from some ancient, brutal mythology. The other half of the program's participants were already deployed 15 miles away, setting up what the instructors euphemistically called opposition forces. This wasn't training anymore, it was warfare with rules of engagement that existed in the gray zones between life and death. Staff Sergeant Patterson's voice crackled through their headsets, barely audible above the engine noise. "Gentlemen and lady," he added with what might have been respect or sarcasm, "welcome to the Predator exercise. For the next 72 hours you are behind enemy lines in hostile territory. Your mission is simple: infiltrate the target zone, acquire intelligence on enemy positions, and exfiltrate without being captured or killed." He paused, letting the weight of that last word settle into their consciousness. "The opposition team has been given your insertion coordinates. They've had 6 hours to prepare kill zones, ambush points, and tracking protocols. They're using live ammunition with the exception of direct headshots, which will be simulated with paint rounds. Everything else, chest shots, limb hits, explosives, those are real. Captain Washington felt his pulse quicken, but not from fear. This was what he lived for, the pure, crystalline moment when survival became the only priority that mattered. His hands automatically checked his gear: rifle, sidearm, ammunition, medical kit, survival equipment, and communications gear. Everything was exactly where it should be, arranged with the obsessive precision that kept special operators alive. In places where mistakes were measured in body bags. Your insertion point is a valley approximately 12 miles from the target zone, Patterson continued. The terrain includes frozen rivers, cliff faces, dense forest, and at least 3 confirmed hostile observation posts. Weather conditions are deteriorating, with temperatures dropping to -20 and wind speeds increasing to 40 miles per hour. Lieutenant Rodriguez grinned beneath his face paint, his teeth white against the camouflage pattern. This was the kind of environment where his force recon training would shine. He'd operated in similar conditions in the mountains of Afghanistan, where the difference between success and failure was often measured in degrees of frostbite and rounds of ammunition. Sergeant Sullivan sat motionless, his mind already working through infiltration routes and evasion tactics. He'd studied the topographical maps during the flight, memorizing elevation changes, water sources, and potential cover positions. In his experience, the key to survival wasn't superior firepower. It was superior information. And Sandra Mitchell? She sat near the rear of the helicopter, her vintage M14 rifle secured across her lap, looking like she was mentally preparing for something far different than what the others expected. While the commandos around her radiated barely contained aggression, she seemed to be entering a state of calm focus that was almost meditative. One more thing, Patterson's voice cut through their individual preparations. The opposition force includes instructors from the program's previous years. These aren't recruits, they're graduates who've been specifically brought back to test your capabilities. They know every trick you're going to try because they've either used them or defended against them. The helicopter began its descent into a valley that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated human beings. Jagged rock formations jutted from the landscape like broken teeth, and the sparse vegetation was already coated with ice that would make every step a potential ankle breaker. The insertion point was a small clearing surrounded by dense forest that could hide a battalion of enemy fighters. 30 seconds. The pilot's voice announced. The commandos began their final equipment checks, running through rituals that had been ingrained through years of combat deployments. Weapons were chambered, safety protocols were reviewed, and escape and evasion routes were mentally rehearsed. Remember, Patterson's final instruction came as the helicopter hovered 3 feet above the frozen ground. This exercise has a 40% casualty rate. Those casualties include broken bones, hypothermia, and at least 1 fatality in the program's history. This is not a game. The commandos fast roped from the helicopter into the landing zone, their boots hitting the frozen ground with practiced silence. Within 60 seconds, they'd established a defensive perimeter and watched their transportation disappear into the gray afternoon sky, leaving them alone in a wilderness that seemed determined to kill them. The first order of business was establishing leadership and operational structure. In most military units, this would have been predetermined by rank and chain of command. But the Thunderbolt program operated under different rules. Leadership had to be earned through demonstrated competence under pressure. Captain Washington immediately began asserting authority based on his SEAL background and natural leadership presence. "All right, people, we need to move fast and smart. I'll take point. Rodriguez handles explosives and heavy weapons. Sullivan manages reconnaissance and communications. What about Mitchell?" Tank Harrison asked, gesturing toward Sandra, who was conducting her own equipment inventory 20 feet away. Washington's expression hardened. She can carry medical supplies and stay in the middle of the formation where she won't get in the way. It was exactly the kind of decision that revealed more about the decision-maker than the situation. Washington was operating from assumptions about capability based on appearance rather than demonstrated performance. It was a mistake that had gotten better soldiers killed in real combat situations. Sandra said nothing, but continued her preparations with the same methodical efficiency she'd shown throughout the program. She'd heard similar dismissals before, and experience had taught her that actions would prove more persuasive than arguments. The team began their movement toward the target zone, with Washington leading them along what appeared to be the most direct route, a ridgeline that offered good visibility, but also made them visible to anyone conducting surveillance from the valley below. It was the kind of tactical decision that prioritized speed over stealth, based on the assumption that superior firepower could overcome superior positioning. They'd been moving for less than 30 minutes when Sandra quietly appeared beside Sergeant Sullivan, who was handling rear security for the formation. "We're being followed," she said simply. Sullivan immediately began scanning their backtrail, using techniques that had kept him alive during reconnaissance missions in some of the world's most dangerous territories. "I don't see anything." 2 men, approximately 400 meters back, moving parallel to our route along the tree line. "They've been maintaining distance since we left the insertion point." Sullivan studied the terrain more carefully, applying skills that had earned him recognition as one of the Army's premier reconnaissance specialists. After several minutes of careful observation, he spotted movement that confirmed Sandra's assessment. Flash of camouflage against the snow that indicated professional tracking. "How did you spot them?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Experience," Sandra replied. "And the fact that they're good, but they're not invisible." Sullivan made a decision. That would have significant consequences for the team's survival. Instead of reporting Sandra's observation to Washington, he chose to quietly verify it himself. Using hand signals, he communicated with Rodriguez, who began conducting his own counter-surveillance sweep. What they discovered was disturbing. The team wasn't just being followed, they were being herded. The opposition force was using classic hunter-killer tactics, allowing Washington to believe he was choosing their route while actually steering them toward a predetermined kill zone. "We need to change direction," Sullivan reported to Washington during the next halt. "Why?" Washington's response was sharp defensive. "Because we're walking into an ambush. The opposition has been tracking us since insertion, and they're steering U.S. toward prepared positions." Washington's face flushed with anger. "How do you know that?" Sullivan hesitated, knowing that crediting Sandra with the intelligence would undermine his credibility with the team leader. "Reconnaissance training. I've been watching our back trail." It was a lie of omission that reflected the complex dynamics operating within the team. Sullivan recognized Sandra's capabilities, but understood that Washington's ego wouldn't allow him to accept tactical advice from someone he'd already categorized as dead weight. The debate over route selection might have continued, but it was interrupted by the sharp crack of a rifle shot that sent snow cascading from a pine branch. Just inches from Washington's head, the opposition force had found them. "Contact front," Washington shouted, diving for cover behind a fallen log as more rifle shots began impacting around their position. The team scattered according to their training, each commando seeking individual cover while maintaining fields of fire that would allow them to support each other. It was a textbook response to a near-ambush situation, executed with the precision that came from years of combat experience. But textbook responses weren't always the right responses. While the commandos engaged the obvious threat to their front, Sandra had identified something they'd missed: movement in the trees to their left flank, indicating a classic, bell-shaped ambush, designed to catch them in crossfire when they focused on the primary threat. She didn't call out a warning. Instead, She simply adjusted her position and waited. The flanking element revealed itself exactly as she'd anticipated, emerging from concealment to establish the killing zone that would have devastated the team. Sandra's M14 rifle spoke once, the heavy .308 round impacting center mass on the lead opposition fighter and marking him as a casualty with a paint round that blossomed across his chest like a bright red flower. Her second shot eliminated the flanking element's automatic weapons specialist before he could establish a firing position. Her third shot forced the remaining opposition fighters to seek cover, disrupting their attack timeline and giving the Commandos time to reposition. "Flanks clear," Sandra called out, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Captain Washington looked toward her position with an expression that combined surprise, confusion, and something that might have been the first stirring of respect. The opposition force's carefully planned ambush had been neutralized by someone he'd dismissed as excess baggage just minutes earlier. The immediate threat was over, but the larger game was just beginning. Somewhere in the wilderness ahead of them, enemy forces were regrouping and planning their next move. And the Commandos were starting to realize that their assumptions about strength, strategy, and survival might need some serious revision. Abandoned mining complex sat like a cancer on the mountainside, its rusted machinery and collapsed structures creating a maze of shadows and death traps that had been purpose-built for exactly this kind of exercise. 24 hours into the Predator exercise, the team had managed to reach their objective despite 3 more ambush attempts, 2 equipment failures, and a night spent in sub-zero temperatures that had pushed even these elite warriors to their physical limits. But reaching the target was only half the mission. Now they had to gather intelligence on enemy positions, while avoiding the kill teams that were systematically hunting them through the complex. Captain Washington crouched behind the twisted remains of a mining conveyor, his breath creating small clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. His face was gaunt from 24 hours of constant stress and minimal food, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone whose confidence had been systematically dismantled by reality. 3 times during their approach, Sandra Mitchell had spotted threats that he'd missed. 3 times her intervention had prevented casualties that would have ended their mission before it began. The woman who'd looked like somebody's librarian was systematically rewriting everything he thought he knew about warfare. Movement, 2 o'clock, approximately 200 meters. Sandra's voice came through their tactical communication system, calm and precise despite the chaos surrounding them. She'd positioned herself in an elevated observation post that offered perfect overwatch of their operational area, position that Washington had initially assigned to Sergeant Sullivan until Sandra had quietly pointed out sightline advantages that even the reconnaissance specialist had missed. Lieutenant Rodriguez adjusted his position, using the thermal scope on his rifle to scan the area Sandra had indicated. It took him nearly 30 seconds to spot what she'd seen immediately: 2 opposition fighters, moving through the industrial debris with the careful precision of hunters who knew their prey was nearby. "Confirmed," Rodriguez whispered into his microphone. 2 hostiles moving toward the main processing building. "Are they alone?" Washington asked, though he'd learned to wait for Sandra's assessment before making tactical decisions. "Negative," Sandra replied after a moment of careful observation. "There's a support element positioned in the tower structure, probably with heavy weapons. This is a probe. They're trying to determine our exact location before committing their main force." The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex. The opposition force wasn't just hunting them. They were conducting a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation that would allow them to coordinate a devastating assault once they'd pinpointed the team's position. Sergeant Sullivan, who'd been conducting his own reconnaissance of the facility's interior, reported back with information that made their situation even more precarious. "I've identified at least 6 defensive positions that have been prepared with interlocking fields of fire. Whoever designed this kill zone knew what they were doing. Tank Harrison, who'd been maintaining security for their temporary command post, added his own sobering assessment. We've got movement on 3 different approach routes. They're not just hunting us, they're surrounding us. The realization hit Washington like a physical blow. They weren't participating in a training exercise. They were living through a tactical masterpiece designed by instructors who'd spent years perfecting the art of psychological and physical destruction. Every decision they'd made, every route they'd chosen, every defensive position they'd occupied had been anticipated and countered by opponents who understood their thinking better than they understood it themselves. "We need to abort," Rodriguez said, voicing what several team members were thinking. "This isn't sustainable. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in terrain that favors the opposition." "Negative," Washington replied automatically, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried just hours earlier. "We complete the mission." "Sir," Sullivan's voice carried a note of respectful disagreement, sometimes tactical withdrawal, "is the smartest option available." The debate might have continued, but it was interrupted by Sandra's quiet voice cutting through their tactical frequency. "There's another option." All eyes turned toward her position, where she was studying the facility through binoculars that looked like they'd seen service in multiple conflicts. Her assessment of their situation had been consistently accurate, and even Washington had learned to listen when she spoke. "Explain," Washington said, though the word came out as more of a plea than a command. "The opposition is expecting us to either assault the facility directly or attempt to evade their security perimeter. Both options play to their strengths and our weaknesses. So what do you suggest?" Sandra lowered her binoculars and looked directly at Washington, her expression serious but not unkind. "We give them what they expect, then do something completely different." What followed was 15 minutes of tactical planning that revealed the depth of Sandra's understanding of asymmetric warfare. Her proposal was audacious, risky, and required skills that most of the team members weren't sure they possessed. But it was also the kind of unconventional thinking that had won battles throughout military history. The plan required splitting their force into 3 elements. The first, led by Rodriguez, would conduct a diversionary assault on the facility's main entrance, drawing the opposition's attention and resources. The second, comprising Sullivan and 2 other commandos, would establish overwatch positions that could provide covering fire and communications relay. The third element would be Sandra, operating alone, infiltrating the facility through an approach route that conventional wisdom would consider impossible. "Absolutely not." Washington's response was immediate and emphatic. "I'm not sending anyone in there alone, especially not." He stopped himself before completing the sentence, but everyone understood what he'd been about to say. "Especially not someone who doesn't belong here. Especially not someone who isn't a real operator. Especially not someone who's just gotten lucky so far." "Captain," Sandra's voice was patient but firm, "this isn't about gender or age or your preconceptions about capability. This is about the mission and the most effective way to complete it." "She's right," Sullivan said quietly, and his support carried weight because of his reputation for tactical brilliance. "The approach she's proposing requires someone with specific infiltration skills. In this team, she's demonstrated the best combination of stealth capability and situational awareness." Washington found himself facing a decision that challenged everything he'd built his identity around. Accept tactical advice from someone he'd dismissed, or maintain authority while potentially sacrificing the mission and team members' lives. Decision was made for him by the sharp crack of sniper fire that sent fragments of concrete exploding from the wall just inches from his head. The opposition had located their position and was beginning the systematic elimination of his team. "Do it," Washington said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that went far beyond tactical considerations. Sandra moved with fluid efficiency, gathering specialized equipment and conducting final checks on gear that most of the team hadn't even recognized as military issue. Her preparations revealed a level of professional expertise that suggested years of experience in exactly this kind of operation. "Give me 30 minutes, she said, securing her rifle across her back and checking the fit of equipment that had clearly been customized for her specific requirements. "Then begin your diversionary assault." "Mitchell," Washington called out, as she prepared to disappear into the facility's maze of industrial structures. She turned back, waiting. "What's your real background?" he asked, the question carrying genuine curiosity rather than hostility. Sandra studied him for a moment, perhaps evaluating whether he was ready for the truth. 28 years, Army Special Operations. Retired as a Master Sergeant 3 years ago after completing classified assignments that don't officially exist. The silence that followed was profound. 28 years meant she'd been conducting special operations before most of these commandos had been born. Her experience in places like Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and a dozen other conflicts that never made the news represented more combat time than the rest of the team combined. "Why didn't you tell us?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and confusion. "Because you wouldn't have believed it," Sandra replied simply. "And because sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one your opponents underestimate." With that, she disappeared into the facility's shadows, moving with the silent confidence of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of becoming invisible. Behind her, 8 elite commandos sat in stunned silence, realizing that they'd been receiving a master class in warfare from someone whose credentials made their own accomplishments look like basic training exercises. The diversionary assault began exactly 30 minutes later, with Rodriguez and his element conducting a textbook demonstration of suppressive fire and movement. The opposition responded predictably, concentrating their resources on repelling what appeared to be the main assault. They never saw Sandra coming when she emerged from the facility. 45 minutes later, she carried intelligence that would not only complete their mission, but fundamentally change how the Thunderbolt program evaluated capability, experience, and the dangerous assumptions that could get good soldiers killed. But more importantly, she'd given 8 elite warriors a lesson in humility that would serve them well in the years of combat that lay ahead of them. The debriefing room at Camp Thunderbolt felt different now. The same concrete walls, the same harsh fluorescent lighting, the same metal chairs arranged in military precision, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Where once there had been casual arrogance and territorial posturing, now there was something approaching reverence mixed with professional curiosity. Staff Sergeant Patterson stood at the front of the room, a thick manila folder in his hands, containing after-action reports that told a story none of the instructors had expected to write. Behind him, a large tactical map displayed the mining facility exercise with colored pins marking team movements, enemy positions, and the infiltration route that Sandra Mitchell had used to complete what several military analysts were already calling a textbook example of solo reconnaissance operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patterson began, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there a week earlier. "In 15 years of running the Thunderbolt program, I have never seen a performance that so completely redefined our understanding of tactical excellence." The 8 surviving Commandos 3 had been eliminated during various phases of the exercise sat in formation, but their attention was focused entirely on the woman in the front row who'd spent the past week systematically dismantling their preconceptions about warfare, leadership, and the dangerous assumptions that could get good soldiers killed. Captain Washington looked like a man who'd undergone a fundamental transformation. The cocky confidence that had defined his personality had been replaced by something deeper and more valuable: professional humility combined with genuine curiosity about how someone could operate at Sandra's level. His notebook was filled with tactical observations and questions that he'd never thought to ask before meeting her. "Mitchell," Patterson continued. Your infiltration of the facility was conducted through an approach route that our instructors had determined was impassable. You successfully gathered intelligence on 12 defensive positions, identified the opposition command structure, and completed extraction without being detected by surveillance systems that had located every other team we've run through this exercise. Lieutenant Rodriguez raised his hand, a gesture that would have seemed ridiculous a week earlier, but now carried genuine respect. Ma'am, I've been analyzing your approach route, and I can't figure out how you negotiated the vertical climb section without specialized equipment. Sandra smiled, the first time any of them had seen her expression soften. Improvisation and experience. The mining equipment provided anchor points that weren't obvious from ground level, and the infrastructure was more stable than it appeared. But the timing, Sergeant Sullivan interjected, his analytical mind still working through the tactical implications. You completed the entire infiltration sequence in 45 minutes. Our best estimates had that route requiring at least 2 hours. Time management becomes critical when you're operating alone, Sandra explained. Every minute increases your exposure risk exponentially. You learn to move efficiently or you don't come home. Tankaresan, who'd spent the week progressing from mockery to grudging respect to something approaching awe, asked the question that several team members had been considering. How many of these operations have you actually conducted? Sandra was quiet for a moment, perhaps calculating what she could share without violating classification restrictions. Enough to understand that survival isn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the most heavily armed. It's about being the smartest and the most adaptable. Patterson consulted his folder and pulled out a document that had clearly been classified until very recently. Mitchell's service record, now partially declassified for training purposes, includes operations in 17 different countries over a 28-year career. She holds certifications in advanced reconnaissance, hostage rescue, counterterrorism, and specialized infiltration techniques that most of you have never heard of. The revelation hit the Commandos like a physical force. They've been training alongside someone whose experience dwarfed their own, whose credentials made their accomplishments look like practice exercises, whose expertise represented the absolute pinnacle of what they aspired to become. The question, Patterson continued, is what you're going to do with this knowledge. Because understanding that you've been outclassed is just the beginning. The real learning happens when you figure out why. What followed was 3 hours of tactical analysis that fundamentally changed how these elite warriors understood their profession. Sandra walked them through decision-making processes that incorporated variables they'd never considered, demonstrated techniques that maximized efficiency while minimizing risk, and explained strategic thinking that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The mistake most operators make, Sandra explained during a discussion of infiltration techniques, is assuming that superior firepower can compensate for inferior positioning. But in special operations, positioning is everything. Get the right position, and you don't need superior firepower. Get the wrong position, and superior firepower won't save you. Captain Washington found himself taking notes like a cadet in his first tactical course. Ma'am, during the facility exercise, how did you know the opposition wouldn't detect your approach route? I didn't know, Sandra replied. But I'd analyzed their defensive setup and determined that they were operating from conventional assumptions about access points. Sometimes the most obvious weakness in a defensive position is the approach that everyone assumes is impossible. The debriefing revealed layer after layer of tactical sophistication that had been invisible to the Commandos during the actual exercise. Sandra's performance hadn't been the result of luck or unconventional techniques, it had been the application of professional expertise developed over decades of operations that most people couldn't imagine. There's something else, Patterson said, consulting another document from his folder. Mitchell's presence in this program wasn't accidental. She was specifically recruited by the Joint Chiefs to evaluate our training protocols and identify potential improvements. The silence that followed was profound. They'd been unknowingly participating in an assessment that would influence how America's most elite warriors were trained for years to come. Their reactions to Sandra, their assumptions about capability, their tactical decisions, everything had been observed and analyzed by someone whose job was to identify weaknesses in the system. So this was all a test? Rodriguez asked, though. His tone suggested curiosity rather than resentment. Everything in the military is a test, Sandra replied. The question is whether you learn from the results or repeat the same mistakes. Sullivan, whose analytical mind had been working through the implications, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. What did you conclude about our training protocols? Sandra exchanged a glance with Patterson, who nodded permission for her to share her assessment. Your technical skills are excellent, she began. Your physical conditioning is superior. Your weapons proficiency is among the best I've encountered. But your tactical thinking is constrained by assumptions that could get you killed in the field, such as... Washington asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. You equate capability with appearance. You assume that unconventional equals ineffective. You prioritize familiar approaches over optimal approaches. And you consistently underestimate opponents who don't fit your preconceptions about what a warrior looks like. The assessment was delivered without malice, but its accuracy was undeniable. Each commando could think of moments during the exercise when they'd made exactly those mistakes, and they could imagine scenarios where such errors would have fatal consequences. In real operations, Sandra continued, your enemies won't look like what you expect. They won't fight the way you've trained to counter. They won't use the weapon systems you've prepared to defeat. Your survival will depend on your ability to adapt to circumstances that don't match your assumptions. Patterson stood up, signaling the end of the formal debriefing. You have the rest of the day to process what you've learned. Tomorrow we begin advanced tactical training, incorporating the lessons from this exercise. Those of you who complete the remaining program will be assigned to units where this knowledge could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. As the commandos filed out of the debriefing room, Captain Washington approached Sandra with an expression that combined respect with genuine curiosity. Ma'am, he said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized their first meeting, I owe you an apology. And I have a question, Sandra nodded, waiting. Why did you let us underestimate you for so long? You could have established credibility immediately by sharing your background. Sandra considered the question carefully. Because underestimation is a tactical advantage that you should never surrender voluntarily. In real operations, being underestimated by your enemies could save your life and the lives of your team members. Learning to recognize and exploit that advantage is as important as any weapon system you'll ever master. Washington nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. It was part of the lesson. Everything was part of the lesson, Sandra replied. The question is whether you'll remember it when your life depends on it. As she walked away, Washington realized that his understanding of warfare, leadership, and professional excellence had been fundamentally transformed by a woman who'd looked like she belonged in a library rather than on a battlefield. It was a lesson in humility that would serve him well in the dangerous years ahead. 3 weeks after the mining facility exercise, Camp Thunderbolt had become a different kind of battlefield. The remaining commandos, now reduced to 6 through a combination of injuries, psychological breaks, and tactical eliminations, moved through their training with a precision and humility that would have been unrecognizable to their former selves. The cocky confidence had been replaced by professional competence, and the territorial aggression had evolved into collaborative tactical thinking. Sandra Mitchell had become their unofficial mentor, though she never formally claimed that role. Instead, she operated as what military theorists called a force multiplier, someone whose presence elevated the performance of everyone around her through demonstrated excellence rather than imposed authority. The final exercise was legendary. Within special operations circles, whispered about in secure facilities and classified briefings. It was called Omega Protocol, and in the program's 15-year history, only 12 individuals had successfully completed it. The exercise was designed not just to test tactical skills, but to break the psychological barriers that separated good operators from legendary ones. Staff. Sergeant Patterson stood before the 6 surviving commandos in a briefing room that had been configured differently than any previous session. Instead of the standard classroom setup, the space had been arranged like a mission planning facility, with tactical computers, satellite imagery, and communications equipment that suggested this exercise would operate at a level of realism that bordered on actual deployment. "Gentlemen and lady," Patterson began, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to reveal information that would fundamentally change their understanding of what they've been training for. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that require presidential authorization to access." Captain Washington, who'd been transformed from an arrogant team leader into a thoughtful tactical analyst, felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't training anymore. This was preparation for something real. 6 months ago, American intelligence agencies identified a terrorist cell operating in an unnamed location that poses an immediate threat to national security. The cell possesses weapons-grade materials and has demonstrated both the capability and intention to use them against civilian targets. Lieutenant Rodriguez leaned forward, his demolitions expertise automatically analyzing the implications of what Patterson had revealed. Weapons-grade materials meant nuclear, biological, or chemical threats that could kill thousands of people in a single attack. Traditional military responses have been ruled out due to political complications and geographical constraints. The mission requires a small team capable of infiltrating a heavily defended position, neutralizing the threat, and extracting without creating an international incident. Sergeant Sullivan's reconnaissance background allowed him to read between the lines of Patterson's briefing. This was a black operation, the kind that didn't officially exist and would never appear in any military records. Success would be measured not just by tactical accomplishment, but by the ability to operate completely invisibly. "Your final exercise," Patterson continued, "will be conducted under conditions that simulate this actual operation. You will infiltrate a facility defended by professional opposition forces, locate and secure the target materials, and exfiltrate without being detected or leaving evidence of your presence." Tank Harrison, whose perspective had been fundamentally altered by weeks of observing Sandra's tactical excellence, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Sir, is this a simulation or a real operation?" Patterson's smile was enigmatic. In special operations, the distinction between simulation and reality becomes meaningless. Your performance will be evaluated as if lives depend on it, because someday they will. The facility they were shown in the satellite imagery looked like a fortress designed by paranoid engineers. Multiple security perimeters, redundant surveillance systems, and defensive positions that covered every conceivable approach route. It was the kind of target that conventional military wisdom would classify as impregnable without massive firepower and acceptable casualties. "You have 72 hours to plan the operation," Patterson announced. "You will have access to any equipment, vehicles, or support systems that exist within the American military inventory. Your only constraints are mission parameters and the requirement for complete invisibility." What followed was the most intensive mission planning session any of them had ever experienced. The 6 commandos, working with Sandra as an unofficial 7th team member, analyzed every aspect of the target facility with the obsessive detail that real operations demanded. Captain Washington found himself deferring to Sandra's tactical insights with a naturalness that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Her experience with similar operations provided context that transformed raw intelligence into actionable plans. The key vulnerability isn't in their defensive perimeter, Sandra observed during their analysis of the facility's security systems. It's in their assumptions about what constitutes a threat. They're prepared for military assault, not surgical infiltration. The plan that emerged from their collaboration was audacious, complex, and required capabilities that pushed each team member to their absolute limits. It involved multiple phases, contingency protocols, and escape routes that accounted for variables that most operators would never consider. Rodriguez would handle electronic warfare, using skills he'd developed in counter-terrorism operations to blind the facility's surveillance systems at precisely timed intervals. Sullivan would manage long-range reconnaissance, providing real-time intelligence updates that would allow the team to adapt to changing conditions. Washington would lead the primary infiltration team, using techniques that Sandra had taught him, for moving through defended positions without triggering alarm systems. Tank Harrison would provide overwatch and extraction support, positioning himself to cover multiple escape routes simultaneously. And Sandra? She would handle the most dangerous part of the operation, locating and securing the weapons-grade materials, while operating alone in the facility's most heavily defended section. "Ma'am," Washington said during their final planning session, "are you sure about taking this solo assignment? If something goes wrong, we won't be able to provide support." Sandra's response carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived similar operations for nearly 3 decades. "Captain, in special operations, you have to trust your team members to handle their assignments without support. That trust is what separates professional operators from amateur adventurers." The infiltration began at 0200 hours on a moonless night that provided perfect cover for their approach. The team moved through the wilderness surrounding the facility with the silent precision of wolves hunting prey, each member executing their assigned role with mechanical perfection. Rodriguez's electronic warfare capabilities proved devastating to the facility's surveillance systems. Security cameras went dark in carefully timed sequences that created blind spots, large enough for human movement, but brief enough to avoid triggering alarm protocols. Motion sensors were spoofed with electromagnetic signals that convinced them they were detecting wildlife rather than human intrusion. Sullivan's reconnaissance provided a constant stream of intelligence updates that allowed the team to avoid guard patrols and exploit weaknesses in the defensive perimeter that hadn't been visible in the satellite imagery. His ability to predict enemy movement patterns based on minimal observation proved crucial to maintaining operational invisibility. Washington's infiltration skills, enhanced by weeks of training with Sandra, allowed him to penetrate security barriers that should have been impregnable. He moved through the facility like a ghost, leaving no trace of his presence while gathering intelligence that confirmed the location of their target. Tank Harrison's overwatch position provided both security and psychological comfort for the team. Knowing that someone with his capabilities was covering their escape routes allowed the other team members to focus entirely on their individual missions without worrying about extraction contingencies. But it was Sandra's performance that transformed the operation from tactical exercise into tactical masterpiece. She penetrated the facility's most secure area, located the weapons-grade materials, and secured them using techniques that none of the instructors had taught because they weren't officially supposed to exist. When the team emerged from the facility 6 hours later, they carried with them not just the simulated weapons materials, but a profound understanding of what special operations could accomplish when conducted by professionals operating at the absolute pinnacle of their capabilities. The debriefing lasted 8 hours and included officials whose security clearances were so high that their names appeared in no public records. The operation was analyzed, dissected, and evaluated by experts who'd spent their careers studying the theoretical limits of what small unit tactics could accomplish. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patterson announced at the conclusion of the formal debriefing, "you have just completed the most successful Omega Protocol operation in the program's history. More importantly, you've demonstrated tactical capabilities that will be studied and emulated by Special Operations Forces for years to come." The 6 commandos looked at each other with expressions that combined exhaustion, satisfaction, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing they'd achieved something extraordinary. But their attention remained focused on Sandra Mitchell, the woman who'd transformed them from individual warriors into a cohesive team capable of accomplishing missions that existed at the very edge of what was possible. "There's one more thing," Patterson continued, consulting a document that bore classification markings none of them had seen before. "This exercise wasn't just training. The threat you neutralized was real, the facility was operational, and the materials you secured represented an actual national security threat that has now been eliminated." The silence that followed was profound. They just completed their first real special operations mission without knowing it, guided by someone whose experience and expertise had turned what could have been a catastrophic failure into a flawless success. As they filed out of the debriefing room, Captain Washington realized that his understanding of warfare, leadership, and professional excellence would never be the same. Sandra Mitchell had given him something more valuable than training. She'd given him a new standard of what it meant to be a warrior. 6 months after graduation from the Thunderbolt program, Captain Derek Washington stood in a classified briefing room in an unnamed facility, preparing for an operation that would have been impossible for the man he'd been before meeting Sandra Mitchell. The arrogant SEAL who dismissed a middle-aged woman as deadweight had been replaced by a tactical leader who understood that assumptions could be more dangerous than enemy bullets. The mission parameters were: familiar, infiltrate a defended position, secure high-value assets, extract without detection. But Washington's approach to the planning reflected lessons that couldn't be taught in any military manual. He studied the target not just for obvious vulnerabilities, but for the assumptions that defenders would make about attackers. He analyzed not just what the enemy would expect, but what they would dismiss as impossible. "Sir," his team's reconnaissance specialist reported during the planning session, "the facility's defensive layout suggests they're expecting a conventional assault. Their blind spots indicate they've prioritized obvious approach routes over unconventional infiltration vectors." Washington smiled, hearing Sandra's voice in the tactical assessment. She'd taught him to look for what wasn't there as much as what was visible, to understand that the most dangerous oversight was the threat you never considered. 3,000 miles away, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez was leading his own team through the mountains of an unnamed country, pursuing targets whose elimination would prevent attacks that would never appear in any newspaper. His approach to explosive demolitions had been revolutionized by months of observing how Sandra solved problems through efficiency rather than overwhelming force. "Smaller charges precisely placed," Rodriguez instructed his demolition specialist. "We want surgical disruption, not total destruction. The goal is to complete the mission without anyone knowing we were here." It was a philosophy that extended far beyond explosives. Rodriguez had learned that the most effective operations were those that achieved their objectives so cleanly that the enemy never understood what had happened to them. In another classified facility, Sergeant Tommy Sullivan was analyzing intelligence patterns that had confounded agency professionals for months. His reconnaissance skills, enhanced by Sandra's lessons about patient observation and systematic analysis, had identified connections that others had missed. "The key isn't in what they're doing," Sullivan explained to his intelligence team. "It's in what they're not doing. The absence of activity in specific sectors tells us more about their intentions than all their visible preparations." He'd learned that intelligence gathering was as much about understanding psychology as it was about collecting data. Sandra had taught him that people revealed more about themselves through their omissions than their actions. Tank Harrison, now leading specialized security operations for high-value targets, had implemented training protocols that challenged every assumption about protective services. His teams were taught to identify threats that didn't look threatening, to prepare for attacks that would come from directions no one expected. The most dangerous enemy, Harrison told his trainees, is the one you never see coming because they don't match your idea of what danger looks like. It was a lesson that extended far beyond personal protection. Harrison had learned that survival often depended on recognizing threats that others dismissed as harmless, but perhaps the most profound transformation had occurred in how all four men approached leadership itself. They'd learned to listen before speaking, to observe before acting, to consider alternatives before committing to obvious solutions. Sandra had taught them that true leadership meant creating conditions where everyone could perform at their highest level, rather than demanding that everyone conform to predetermined expectations. The ripple effects of their transformation extended throughout the special operations community. Training protocols were revised to emphasize adaptability over conformity. Mission planning began incorporating unconventional approaches as standard options rather than desperate alternatives. Most importantly, the community began recognizing that expertise could come from unexpected sources. Staff Sergeant Patterson, now promoted to Master Sergeant and running an expanded version of the Thunderbolt program, had institutionalized many of Sandra's teaching methods. New candidates were exposed to scenarios designed to challenge their assumptions about capability, threat assessment, and tactical thinking. The most dangerous enemy you'll face, Patterson told each new class, isn't the one with superior firepower or better defensive positions. It's the one you underestimate because they don't match your preconceptions about what danger looks like. The program's success rate had improved dramatically since incorporating Sandra's lessons. More importantly, the graduates were performing at levels that suggested a fundamental evolution in how special operations could be conducted. Sandra herself had returned to civilian life, though her definition of civilian remained classified at levels that required presidential authorization to access. She operated as a consultant for various agencies, helping them identify blind spots in their tactical thinking and preparing their personnel for threats that conventional training couldn't address. But her most important legacy lived in the minds of the warriors she'd trained. They carried her lessons into conflicts around the world, applying tactical wisdom that had been earned through decades of operations that officially never happened. Captain Washington, preparing for his current mission, found himself making decisions based on questions that Sandra had taught him to ask. Not just how do we accomplish the objective, but how do we accomplish it in a way that our enemies never understand what happened. The operation succeeded flawlessly, completed with the kind of surgical precision that left no trace of American involvement. As Washington's team extracted from the target area, he reflected on how far he'd traveled from the arrogant young SEAL who dismissed a middle-aged woman as unsuitable for elite military training. The lesson Sandra had taught wasn't just about tactical excellence or technical skills. It was about recognizing that wisdom could come from unexpected sources, that assumptions could be more dangerous than enemy weapons, and that the most effective warriors were those who never stopped learning from anyone who had something valuable to teach. Years later, when military historians analyzed the evolution of American special operations during this period, they would identify a marked improvement in mission success rates and operational sophistication. They would note the reduced casualty rates, the increased effectiveness of unconventional tactics, and the enhanced ability of American forces to operate invisibly in hostile environments. But the true measure of Sandra Mitchell's impact couldn't be found in statistical analyses or after-action reports. It lived in the minds of warriors who'd learned to question their assumptions, to respect unexpected sources of wisdom, and to understand that the most dangerous oversight was the threat they never considered: the elite commandos who'd laughed At her age had learned something more valuable than any tactical technique or weapon system. They'd learned humility, adaptability, and the recognition that true strength often came disguised as apparent weakness. It was a lesson that would serve them well in the dangerous years ahead, as they faced enemies who understood that the most effective attacks came from directions that defenders never thought to guard against. Sandra Mitchell had given them more than training. She'd given them a new way of seeing the world that would keep them alive when nothing else could. And in the unforgiving calculus of special operations, that was the most valuable gift anyone could receive. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.